It is the 29th of May, 1453, and the last Roman emperor is taking off his crown so that no one will be able to find his body. The walls his city had trusted for 1,000 years are breached. The defense is dissolving around him, so he strips off the purple and every mark of rank, draws his sword, and charges into the oncoming soldiers as an anonymous man. He vanishes into the press, and no one ever finds him. A line of emperors that had run unbroken for 15 centuries ends in a man who made himself nameless on purpose. That happened. It is not legend. And the part that should bother you is that everyone involved had seen it coming for 250 years. To understand how a civilization watches its own death approach for that long and cannot lift a finger to stop it, we have to go back to a foundryman named Orban, who offered this same emperor the cannon that would shatter those walls, and found the empire too broke to buy it. From there, we pass through a sack committed by fellow Christians in 1204. A coronation served on clay because the gold was already gone, and a secret count of the city's defenders that the emperor forbade anyone to repeat. By the end, you will understand that Constantinople held first refusal on the weapon that killed it, that knowing was never the thing that could have saved it, and why the institutions you are standing inside today are built the same way. So settle in and subscribe or join if you have not yet. If you want the deeper cuts, the wider story of collapse and physics and history this channel lives in, that is what the Patreon is for. Stay with me to the end, because the most unsettling part is not that they failed to see the end coming. It is what they saw in the final week. In an eclipse and a fallen icon, and a strange light rising off the dome of their great cathedral and vanishing into the sky, at the exact moment when seeing it had stopped changing anything at all. Let's go back to where this began. There is a man whose name almost nobody remembers, and he is the reason the longest-lived empire in the history of the world is gone. His name was Orban. He was a foundryman, a caster of bronze, probably from somewhere in what is now Hungary or Transylvania, and in the year 1452 he walked into the dying capital of the Roman Empire and offered to sell the emperor a weapon that could knock down any wall ever built. The emperor's name was Constantine, the 11th of that name to sit on the throne, and he wanted the weapon. He understood exactly what it was. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what would happen if it ended up in the wrong hands. And he could not afford it. That is the part I want you to hold on to before we go anywhere else, because everything that follows is contained in it. The cannon that brought down the walls of Constantinople, the walls that had stood for 1,000 years and turned away every army that had ever come for them, was offered to Constantinople first. The city had the right of first refusal on the instrument of its own death, and the reason it said no was not strategy, and it was not arrogance, and it was not some failure to see the danger. The reason was that the treasury was empty. The Roman Empire, and I mean the actual Roman Empire, the unbroken legal continuation of the state that Augustus founded, the empire that had governed the Mediterranean world for 15 centuries, could not come up with the wages of a single foreign engineer. So Orban did what any contractor does when the client cannot pay. He packed up his designs and he walked a few miles across the water to the client who could. That client was a 21-year-old Ottoman sultan named Mehmed, and Mehmed did not haggle. He gave Orban 4 times the salary the man had dared to ask for. He gave him a workshop, raw materials, assistance, and a single question. He asked whether the gun could batter down the walls of Constantinople. And Orban, according to the contemporary historian Dukas, told him that it could bring down the walls of Babylon itself. They cast it at Edirne over about 3 months in the winter of 1452 going into 1453. When it was finished, it was roughly 27 feet long. The barrel walls were 8 inches of solid bronze, and it threw a stone ball that weighed somewhere around 1,200 pounds. To move it from the foundry to the walls of the city took a team of 60 oxen, and as many as 400 men walking alongside to keep it from sliding off the road. When they test-fired it outside Adin, the report says the stone travelled more than a mile and buried itself 6 feet into the earth, and that pregnant women in the surrounding villages miscarried at the sound. The gun was so large it could only be fired about 7 times in a single day, because it had to be cooled between shots, reportedly with warm oil, or the bronze would crack. That slow rhythm is going to matter later in ways you would not expect. Hold it in the back of your mind. The way this story almost always gets told, it is a single cruel irony. The empire that could not afford the gun was destroyed by the gun. A neat piece of historical theatre. The cosmos has a sense of humour, and it is a black one. And then they move on. But Orban is not an irony. Orban is a symptom. The thing that happened with that cannon. The thing where a dying state could see precisely what it needed and precisely what would happen if it failed to get it, and was simply too hollowed out to act. That was not a single bad afternoon in the emperor's accounting office. That was the entire condition of the Eastern Roman Empire for the last 250 years of its life. And once you see it in the canon, you start seeing it everywhere, in every decade, in every reign, in document after document written by men who understood with total clarity that their world was ending and who were utterly unable to stop it. Here is the claim this whole story is built on, and I want to be precise about it, because the precision is the entire point. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not a surprise. It was not a bolt from the blue. It was not the moment a healthy empire was suddenly struck down by a rising power. The fall of Constantinople was the most thoroughly predicted, most clearly foreseen, most exhaustively documented collapse in the medieval world. People saw it coming for 2 centuries. Emperors saw it. Bishops saw it. Merchants in Venice and Genoa saw it and priced it into their loans. Scholars wrote it down. The Ottomans across the strait certainly saw it. And the population of the city itself, in the final weeks, read their own ending in the sky, in an eclipse and a thunderstorm, and a strange light around the dome of their great cathedral, and they were right to read it that way, because the thing they were reading had been true for a very long time, and none of it mattered. The seeing did not save them. That is the thing I cannot stop turning over, and it is the reason I want to spend the next 2.5 hours with you inside this story. We tend to believe, almost as an article of faith, that knowledge is power, that if you can just see the catastrophe coming, if you can name it and measure it and write the report, you can act on it. The fall of Constantinople is the clearest case in recorded history of a civilization that saw the catastrophe coming in full detail, that named it and measured it and wrote the report, generation after generation, and could not act on it. Not because the people were stupid. They were not stupid. Some of the sharpest minds of the age spent their entire lives on this exact problem. They could not act because the things that would have saved the empire were things the empire could not produce. The knowing and the doing had come apart, and once they come apart, knowing is just a way of watching yourself die with your eyes open. I am going to show you how that happened. I am going to show you the wound that started it, which was inflicted not by the Turks, but by other Christians, and which never healed. I am going to walk you through the accounts of an empire so broke that it crowned its emperor in a ceremony where the crown jewels were colored glass and the banquet was served on clay. I am going to take you to a church council in Italy where the dying empire tried to buy its survival with the one currency it had left, which was its soul, and I am going to show you why that payment bought nothing at all. And then I am going to take you to the walls in the spring of 1453 and stand you next to the last Roman emperor as he does the arithmetic of his own defense and arrives at a number that he already knows is not enough. But before any of that, you need to understand something about why this is so hard to look at directly, and why the version you may have absorbed somewhere along the way, the version where a 1,000-year-old empire is overrun by a new and hungry power, is not so much wrong as it is comfortably late. It picks up the story at the funeral and calls it a murder. The empire that died in 1453 had been dying since 1204. The wound that killed it was already 249 years old when the cannon fired, and the people who inflicted that wound were not the people you would expect. To understand the wound, you have to go to Venice in the year 1201, where a group of French knights had arrived with a problem of logistics. They had taken a vow to go on crusade, the fourth of the Great Crusades, and their plan was to strike at Egypt, the soft underbelly of Muslim power, and from there to retake Jerusalem. To get an army to Egypt, you need ships, a great many ships, and there was only one power in the Mediterranean that could build and crew a fleet on that scale. That power was the Republic of Venice, and the Venetians, led by a doge named Enrico Dandolo, agreed to build the fleet. Dandolo was somewhere past 90 years old and almost completely blind, and he was one of the most coldly brilliant strategic minds of the entire Middle Ages. He named a price. The Crusaders agreed to it. And then the Crusaders failed to raise the money. They had contracted for a fleet size to carry an army far larger than the one that actually showed up, and when the bills came due, they were tens of thousands of silver marks short. This is the moment the Fourth Crusade became something other than a crusade. Dandolo did not forgive the debt. Venice had mortgaged a year of its economy to build those ships, and Dandolo intended to be paid. So he offered the Crusaders a deal: work off the debt. There was a Christian city on the Adriatic coast called Zara that had recently rebelled against Venetian control, and if the Crusaders would help Venice take it back, the debt could wait. The Crusaders, trapped, agreed, and in November of 1202, an army that had sworn to liberate Jerusalem instead sacked a Christian city. The Pope, Innocent III, was so appalled that he excommunicated the entire expedition, and the crusade had not even reached its real target yet. Then the real opportunity arrived, wearing the face of a young man with a grievance. There was a Byzantine prince named Alexios, the son of a deposed emperor, and he came to the Crusaders with an offer that sounded like deliverance. "Put me on the throne of Constantinople," he said. "Restore my father, and I will pay you everything you owe Venice and more. I will give you 200,000 silver marks. I will fund your crusade to Egypt. I will bring the Eastern Church back under the authority of Rome, healing a schism that was a century and a half old." It was a fantasy. The young man had no way to deliver a fraction of what he promised. But the Crusaders did not know that, and the promise was exactly the size of their desperation. So the fleet that had been built to save Jerusalem turned its prows toward the largest, richest, most heavily fortified Christian city on earth. And here I have to stop and correct something, because the way this usually gets taught does a quiet violence to the truth. We are told a story in which Byzantium declined and then the Ottomans, a rising and vigorous power, conquered it. Decline and fall. East versus west. Cross versus crescent. It is clean, and it is almost entirely a lie of emphasis. The single most catastrophic blow the Eastern Roman Empire ever suffered, the one from which it never structurally recovered, was not delivered by any Muslim army. It was delivered in April of 1204 by a Christian army flying the cross, blessed for crusade, sailing in Venetian ships. The people who broke Byzantium were the people who were supposed to be defending Christendom. That is not a fringe revisionist take. That is the mainstream scholarly consensus, and the fact that it sits so uneasily next to the comfortable version should tell you something about which parts of history we choose to remember and which parts we quietly file away. The walls of Constantinople had never been taken by storm, not by the Persians, not by the Avars, not by the Arabs who besieged the city twice, not by the Rus, not by the Bulgars. For nearly 900 years, the land walls had held against everything thrown at them. The Crusaders did not break the land walls either. They came at the city from the water, from the Golden Horn, where the sea walls were lower and the great chain that normally sealed the harbour had been forced. On the 12th of April 1204, they got men onto the seaward ramparts, opened the gates from inside, and poured into the city. And then for 3 days they did to the greatest city in Christendom what no infidel army had ever managed to do. They burned a substantial portion of it. They smashed into the churches, and Constantinople was a city of churches, the repository of 1,000 years of accumulated Christian relics and Roman treasure and Greek learning. In the great church of Hagia Sophia, the cathedral that was the spiritual heart of the Eastern world, they tore the silver from the iconostasis, they smashed the altar for the precious stones set into it, and according to the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniatis, who was there and watched it happen, they put a prostitute on the throne of the patriarch and had her sing bawdy songs while soldiers drank from the holy vessels. They loaded mules into the church to carry out the loot, and when the animals slipped on the marble and broke their legs, they butchered them where they fell. The 4 great bronze horses that had stood in the city's hippodrome, ancient even then, were pried loose and shipped to Venice, where they stand to this day over the doorway of St. Mark's Basilica. If you have ever seen them, you have seen plunder from the murder of the Roman Empire, displayed for 8 centuries as a civic ornament. When the looting was done, they divided the corpse. There is an actual document, the Partitio Romaniae, the partition of the Empire of the Romans, drawn up in advance like the will of a man not yet dead, parceling out the provinces of the empire among the Venetians and the various Crusader lords. A Flemish count named Baldwin was crowned emperor of a new Latin empire in Hagia Sophia, sitting on the throne of the Caesars in a city he had helped to sack. And the Roman Empire, as a single functioning state, simply ceased to exist. It shattered into pieces. A government in exile formed across the water at Nicaea. Another Greek successor state formed in the west at Epirus. A third, the Empire of Trebizond, clung to the far southern shore of the Black Sea. The center was gone, occupied by foreigners, and the Greek world was a scatter of fragments around a hole where their capital used to be. Now here is where you have to resist the urge to feel relief, because the story seems to offer one. In 1261, 57 years later, the Greeks took the city back. The forces of the Nicaean state, under an emperor named Michael, the 8th Palaeologos, recovered Constantinople almost by accident, slipping in through a gate while the bulk of the Latin garrison was away. Michael entered the city in triumph, the icon of the Virgin carried before him, and had himself crowned in Hagia Sophia, and the Roman Empire was restored. It sounds like a resurrection. It was nothing of the kind. What Michael recovered was not the empire. It was the empire's grave marker, with the empire's name still carved on it. Because in those 57 years, the thing that had made Constantinople the heart of the world had been bled out of it and could not be put back. The population, which may have been as high as 400,000 before the sack, had collapsed. The treasury that had funded the most sophisticated state apparatus in Europe had been carried off to Venice and dispersed across a dozen Crusader fiefs. The trade networks had been captured, and most importantly, the strategic logic of the empire had been inverted. For 700 years, the survival of the Eastern Roman state had depended on one thing above all others: the defense of Anatolia, the great landmass of what is now Turkey, which was the empire's heartland, its source of soldiers, of grain, of taxes, of population. While the Greeks were fragmented and fighting to recover their capital, they could not defend Anatolia, and into that vacuum came the Turkish nomadic bands, pushing west year by year, settling, taking the high country, then the valleys, then the towns. By the time Michael VIII took back Constantinople, the Anatolian heartland was already slipping away, and his obsession with holding the recovered capital meant that it kept slipping, because he poured what little he had into the west and left the eastern frontier to rot. So the recovery of 1261 was a trap disguised as a triumph. Michael got the prestige of the imperial city and lost the substance of the empire. He spent the rest of his reign and most of his money fending off Western attempts to reconquer the city, including a planned crusade by Charles of Anjou that would have finished the Greeks for good, and which Michael only escaped by a feat of diplomacy and bribery that drained the last of the reserves. The restored empire never recovered the wealth, never recovered the territory, never recovered the army it had possessed before the sack. The historian Donald Nicol, who spent a career studying these final centuries, described the restored state with a phrase I have not been able to get out of my head since I first read it. He called it an island of Christian culture around whose walls lapped the waters of Islam. An island, surrounded, with the tide already coming in. And this is the moment, around the recovery that was not a recovery, that the diagnosis became legible to anyone with the stomach to read it. Because the men running the restored empire were not fools, and they could see the ledger. They could see that the territory was a fraction of what it had been. They could see that the heartland was gone. They could see that the population would not come back, that the trade was in foreign hands, that the army could no longer be paid. The early Paleologan court was full of brilliant, educated, clear-eyed men, scholars and statesmen who could read Thucydides in the original and apply his lessons to their own decline. They knew, from the late 13th century onward, the most sophisticated political minds in the Greek world understood, in their bones and on paper, that the trajectory pointed in one direction only. And that is the first time in this story you run into the thing that is going to define all of it. The knowing was already there. The clear sight was already there. Almost 200 years before the cannon fired, the people in charge already understood the shape of the ending. What they did not have, what they would never again have, was the capacity to change it. The wound of 1204 did not just take territory and treasure. It took something harder to name and impossible to rebuild. It took the empire's ability to act on what it knew. And without that, all the clear sight in the world is just a long, lucid, helpless watching. But to see how completely that capacity had drained away, you have to follow the money. And the story of Byzantine money in the 14th century is so bleak and so strange and so precisely documented by the people living through it that when I first read the details, I assumed I was reading exaggeration. I was not. In the year 1343, the Empress of the Romans pawned the crown jewels to the Republic of Venice. Her name was Anna of Savoy. She was the widow of one emperor and the mother of another, a boy not yet old enough to rule, and she was fighting a civil war to keep his throne. She needed cash to hire soldiers, and the empire had no cash, so she gathered up the imperial regalia, the jeweled crowns and the gem-encrusted ornaments that were the physical symbols of 1,500 years of Roman sovereignty, and she sent them to Venice as collateral on a loan. The Venetians advanced her 30,000 ducats against them. To give you a sense of what that number meant, 30,000 ducats was roughly twice the entire annual revenue of the city of Constantinople at the time. The symbols of Roman imperial majesty, the literal crown of the Caesars, were worth, on the open market, 2 years of what the capital could tax. The jewels were never redeemed, not by Anna, not by her son, not by anyone. The empire raised the matter with Venice again and again over the following century. In 1390, in 1406, in 1418, in 1423, in 1442, in 1448, always asking, always hoping, never able to produce the 30,000 ducats to buy back its own crown. The regalia of the Roman Empire sat in a Venetian vault as unredeemed pawn for more than 100 years, until the empire that had pledged them no longer existed to claim them. I want you to feel the full strangeness of that. The state did not just run out of money. It pawned its own soul as a financial instrument and then died still owing the principal. And the civil war that the jewels were pawned to fund is itself part of the horror, because it tells you something about the kind of decline this was. This was not an empire that spent its last strength defending itself against the enemy at the gates. This was an empire that spent its last strength fighting itself. The 14th century in Byzantium is a near-continuous sequence of civil wars. Greeks against Greeks, faction against faction, 2 and sometimes 3 claimants to the throne tearing the remaining provinces apart, while the Ottomans watched from across the water and took notes. The most destructive of these wars pitted the regency for the boy emperor John V against a brilliant aristocrat and statesman named John Cantacosenos, and it dragged on for years. And it did more damage to what remained of the empire than any foreign invasion of the period. But it is the way Cantacosenos won that should make the hair on your arms stand up, because it is the exact pattern of the canon, played out 100 years earlier. To win his civil war, Cantacosenos needed soldiers he could not pay for in coin, so he made an alliance. He reached across the water to the rising Turkish emirate on the Asian shore, to its ruler Orhan, and he hired Ottoman troops to fight his Greek rivals. He sealed the alliance by giving Orhan his own daughter, a Byzantine princess named Theodora, in marriage. A Roman emperor married his daughter to a Muslim ruler and brought Ottoman armies into the heart of the Greek world to help him win a Greek civil war. He could see the larger danger. Of course, he could see it. He was one of the most intelligent men of his century, and he later wrote his own history in which he agonizes over exactly these choices. He saw the danger and he made the deal anyway, because the immediate problem, the rival faction, was in front of him, and the larger problem, the Turks, was a year or a decade away, and a desperate man discounts the future at a brutal rate. That is what the absence of capacity does to a person. It does not blind them. It forces them, with their eyes fully open, to keep making the move that kills them slowly in order to survive the thing that would kill them today. When Cantacosenos finally won and had himself crowned senior emperor in 1347, the coronation became the single most perfect image of the empire's condition that the entire period produced, and we know the details because a scholar named Nikephoros Gregoras was there and wrote them down. Gregoras was no propagandist. He was a polymath, an astronomer who had proposed a reform of the calendar 150 years before the West got around to it, a man who counted and measured for a living. And he recorded that at the imperial coronation banquet, the crowns and the vestments that should have blazed with gold and gemstones were made of gilded leather and colored glass. The vessels on the banquet table, which at the court of the Caesars would have been gold and silver, were pewter and clay, tin and earthenware. He wrote that the imperial treasury at that moment contained, and this is his phrase, nothing but the atoms of Epicurus, nothing but empty space and a few scattered particles. A learned joke about the void, told by a man watching his civilization be served its coronation feast on crockery. Think about the people in that room. They were not peasants who did not know any better. They were the senatorial aristocracy of Rome, the inheritors of an unbroken imperial tradition that stretched back to Augustus, and they sat at the coronation of their emperor, eating off clay plates and looking at a crown of painted glass, and every single one of them knew exactly what it meant. There is a particular flavor of despair, available only to the sophisticated. The despair of people educated enough to measure the precise dimensions of their own decline. The Byzantines had that despair in abundance. They were possibly the most historically self-aware society that has ever existed. They knew they were the Romans. They knew what Rome had been. They had the texts. They had the records. They could quote the dimensions of the loss to the decimal. And it did them no good whatsoever. The humiliations compounded. In 1369, that same John V, the boy whose throne the jewels had been pawned to defend, now a grown emperor, traveled to the west in person to beg for military aid against the Turks. He went all the way to Rome. He personally converted to the Roman Catholic faith in a desperate bid to win Western support, which earned him nothing because he could not deliver his church or his people along with himself. And on his way home, he stopped in Venice. And in Venice, the Roman emperor was detained, not honored, detained as a debtor. The Venetians held the emperor of the Romans as surety against the money the empire still owed, including the old debt of the crown jewels, and he could not leave the city until the accounts were settled. He sat in Venice as a hostage to his own state's insolvency, and he had to send home for his son to raise the ransom, and his elder son refused, and it was only the younger son, the future Manuel II, who scraped together enough to free his father. The emperor of the Romans, ransomed from a debtor's arrest by his own child. By the end of the 14th century, the empire had become, in the most literal sense, a vassal of the people it was supposed to be resisting. John V and his successors were required to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, to provide troops to the Ottoman army, and to present themselves at the Sultan's court when summoned. Byzantine emperors rode in Ottoman military campaigns as subordinate allies, helping the Turks conquer the last Christian holdouts in Anatolia, fighting under the Sultan's banner against other Christians. Manuel II, one of the finest men ever to wear the Byzantine purple, a genuine scholar and theologian, spent part of his early career as a vassal in the Sultan's army, and he later wrote, with a bitterness you can still feel across 600 years, about being forced to help destroy the very people he should have been protecting. He knew exactly what he was. He wrote it down. And he did it anyway, because the alternative was the immediate destruction of the city, and so he chose the slow death over the fast one, the way they always did. The way the absence of capacity always forces you to. And all of this was happening while the actual engine of the regional economy sat in plain view, just across a narrow strip of water from the imperial palace, in foreign hands. Directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople was a district called Galata, also called Pera, and it was a colony of the Republic of Genoa. The Genoese, like the Venetians, had extracted enormous trade privileges from the weakened empire, and from Galata they ran the commerce of the entire region. The customs revenue collected at Galata, the duties on the ships passing through the strait, the profits of the trade that flowed through the Bosphorus, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, one of the richest choke points in the world. Most of that wealth went to Genoa. There are records suggesting that in this period, the customs house at Galata was collecting something like 7 times the revenue of the customs house in Constantinople itself, on the opposite shore, within sight of the emperor's windows. The empire owned the most valuable real estate in the medieval world, the city that controlled the only sea route between two seas, and it watched foreigners grow rich on it, while its own treasury held the atoms of Epicurus. And then, in the middle of all of this, in 1347, the same year as the glass crown coronation, the Black Death arrived. It came up through the Black Sea trade routes, it hit Constantinople early, and it killed, by the most common estimates, somewhere around half the population of the city. The Emperor Cantacozinos lost his own son to it and wrote a description of the symptoms so clinically precise that historians of medicine still cite it. So lay the empire's condition fully bare. A shrunken territory, an empty treasury that had pawned the crown itself, a capital whose trade was run by foreigners, a ruling class reduced to vassalage, riding in the enemy's army, a series of civil wars that had invited that enemy into Europe in the first place. And now, half the population dead in a single visitation of plague. This was the body that would have to defend itself, a century later, against the largest siege army the region had ever seen. I said at the start that the empire could see what was coming. I want to be even more specific now, because the second foreshadowing of where this ends lives right here, in the 14th century, in the minds of these brilliant, doomed, clear-eyed men. They did not merely sense a vague decline. Some of them performed something close to a structural autopsy on a living patient. They wrote analyses of why the empire was failing that read in places like modern systems theory. They identified the loss of the heartland, the dependence on foreign mercenaries, the hemorrhage of trade revenue, the fragmentation of authority. They diagnosed it correctly. And here is the thing I keep circling back to. The thing I am going to ask you to carry with you all the way to the walls. A correct diagnosis is only useful to a patient who can act on the treatment. These men wrote prescriptions that the body of the empire was no longer capable of filling. They could name the disease perfectly, and the naming changed nothing, because the cure required resources that 1204 had carried off to Venice, and capacities that a century of civil war had burned, and a unity that the next great crisis, the one waiting in the next century, would shatter completely and permanently. Because there was one more catastrophe coming before the cannon, and it did not look like a catastrophe at all. It looked, to the men who arranged it, like the empire's last and best hope of salvation. It looked like rescue, and it was the single event that more than any other proves the thesis of this entire story. Because it is the moment the empire saw the solution clearly, reached out and grasped it with both hands, paid for it in the most precious currency it had, and discovered that knowing the answer and even seizing the answer can still, somehow, change absolutely nothing. But to understand why that rescue failed, you first have to watch the Turks finish crossing into Europe. And you have to understand that they crossed on the back of an earthquake, through a gate that the Byzantines themselves had quite literally opened. On the night of the 1st or 2nd of March, 1354, the earth moved along the Gallipoli Peninsula, the narrow tongue of European land that guards the entrance to the Dardanelles, and a powerful earthquake leveled the walls and many of the buildings of the town the Greeks called Kallipolis. The Greek inhabitants fled the ruins, and across the water, on the Asian shore, were Ottoman soldiers, the same soldiers that the Byzantine civil wars had been hiring as mercenaries for years, now led by Sliman, the son of the Emir Orhan, the same Orhan who had married the Byzantine princess Theodora. Sliman crossed the water, walked into the abandoned, broken town, and occupied it. He moved Turkish families into the houses the Greeks had fled. He rebuilt the fallen walls, and he refused to leave. The Byzantines protested. Cantacuzenos, still emperor at this point, sent envoys and even offered money for the return of the town. And the Ottoman answer was the answer of men who read the world the same way the Byzantines did, through the language of divine intention. They said that they had not taken Gallipoli by force. God had thrown down its walls in the earthquake, and they had merely walked into what God had opened for them. To give the town back would be to refuse a gift from God. It was, in its way, a brilliant piece of theology, and it was also simply true that they were not leaving. The earthquake had handed the Ottomans their first permanent, fortified foothold on the European continent, a base from which everything that followed became possible. The historian Donald Nicol, the same scholar who called the restored empire an island in a rising sea, identified this moment, the Ottoman seizure of Gallipoli in 1354, as the point of no return. After this, he wrote, the fall of the empire was virtually inevitable, not certain in its timing, not certain in its details, but inevitable in its direction. From 1354 onward, the Ottomans were no longer a force across the water that might be managed or bought off or played against rival Turks. They were in Europe, behind the city, with a secure crossing and a growing European territory, and the entire strategic situation had inverted. Constantinople was no longer a Christian capital facing a Muslim frontier to its east. It was rapidly becoming a Christian island inside a Muslim sea, with the enemy not only to the east, but to the north and west as well, on the same continent, astride the roads, between the city and any help that might come from the rest of Christendom. And I want to point at the texture of how it happened, because it is the pattern again. The Ottomans got their foothold in Europe, partly because the Byzantines had hired them into Europe to fight Byzantine civil wars, and partly because an earthquake handed them a town, and the Byzantines could not muster the force to take it back. At every stage, the Greeks could see it happening. Cantacosanos saw it so clearly that he abdicated and became a monk not long after, spending his retirement writing a history in which he tries to justify the choices that let it happen. The choices he knew, even as he made them, were leading exactly here. Seeing it did not stop it. The capacity to stop it was gone, and had been gone since 1204, and all that remained was the lucidity to watch. What followed was a slow, decades-long contraction that you could map decade by decade like the tightening of a noose. In 1369, the Ottomans took Adrianople, the great city of Thrace, and within a few years they made it their capital. Stop and absorb that. The Ottoman Empire was now ruling from a European city, a former Roman city, closer to the heart of old Byzantine Europe than to its own Anatolian origins. The Serbian Empire that might have served as a Christian bulwark in the Balkans was broken at the Battle of the Maritsa River in 1371 and shattered for good at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Bulgaria was absorbed. The great Byzantine second city of Thessalonica, the empire's last major urban center beyond the capital, was surrendered to the Ottomans in 1387, briefly recovered, then in desperation handed over to the Venetians in 1423 because the empire could not defend it, and finally stormed and sacked by the Ottomans in 1430. Each loss tightened the circle. By the year 1400, the Roman Empire, the entity that had once governed from Spain to Syria, from the Danube to the Sahara, consisted of the city of Constantinople, a few islands in the Sea of Marmara, a separate territory down in the southern Greek peninsula called the Despotate of the Morea, and, technically and separately, the little empire of Trebizond, clinging to the far Black Sea coast. A traveller named Pero Tafur, a Spaniard who visited Constantinople in the 1430s, looked at the emperor in his shrunken capital and wrote the single most devastating one-line summary of the whole situation. He said, the emperor was like a bishop without a see, a figure with an enormous, ancient title and almost nothing left to rule. The title still said Emperor of the Romans, Autocrat, equal of the Apostles. The reality was a man governing a depopulated city and waiting. Now here is where the story does something so strange that if a novelist wrote it, you would put the book down. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, called the Thunderbolt, had decided to finish the job. He blockaded Constantinople. He built a fortress on the Asian shore to choke the city. The siege went on for years, on and off, from about 1394, and the city was slowly starving. The Emperor Manuel II, the scholar, the man who had ridden in the Sultan's army as a vassal, left his dying capital and travelled across Europe in person, going to Venice, to Paris, to London, to beg the kings of the West for an army. He was received with great ceremony and enormous sympathy, and almost no actual help. He was in the West, still waiting for an army that was not coming, when salvation arrived from a direction no one in Constantinople was even looking. In the year 1402, 1400 miles to the east, on a plain near Ankara, the army of Sultan Bayezid met the army of Timur, the Central Asian conqueror that the West would later call Tamerlane, and Timur destroyed it. Bayezid himself was captured and died in captivity. The Ottoman state collapsed into a civil war among Bayezid's sons that lasted more than a decade. And just like that, with no action whatsoever on the part of Byzantium, the siege of Constantinople was lifted, the pressure came off, and the empire that had been at the edge of extinction was suddenly granted another 50 years of life. It was not saved by its own strength, because it had none. It was not saved by the West, which had sent words and ceremony and no army. It was saved by a Mongol warlord on a battlefield in central Anatolia who had never seen Constantinople and did not care whether it lived or died. The reprieve was an accident. And I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to call that reprieve a piece of good fortune, and in the narrowest sense it was. But sit with what it actually was. The empire was given 50 more years, 50 more years of being an island in a rising sea, 50 more years of pawned jewels and foreign customs houses and emperors as vassals, 50 more years of the lucid, helpless watching. The reprieve did not give the empire the one thing it had lacked since 1204, which was the capacity to change its trajectory. It gave it more time on the same trajectory. It extended the watching. And the men who lived through those 50 years, the last generation of Byzantines, knew that too. They were not fooled by the reprieve. Some of them used the time to make one last, desperate, all-or-nothing attempt to acquire the only thing that could actually save them, which was a Western army large enough to matter. And the price the West demanded for that army was the one price that, when they finally paid it, would tear the dying city apart from the inside. This is the second time I am going to point directly at the ending, and this time I want to be more explicit than I was before, because we are now close enough to feel it coming. Everything you have watched so far has been about the gap between knowing and doing. The Byzantines knew about the wound of 1204. They knew the treasury was empty. They knew the trade was lost, the heartland gone, the enemy in Europe, the circle closing. They knew all of it with a precision that is almost unbearable to read, and not one piece of that knowledge translated into the power to change the outcome. What is coming next, the attempt to buy a Western army with a religious surrender, is the purest and most painful version of this. Because here the gap between knowing and doing closes for one brief moment. Here, finally, they know the answer and they actually do the thing. They pay the price. They make the deal. And it will turn out that even doing the right thing, even paying the impossible price, even successfully executing the only strategy that could have worked, changes nothing. Because the strategy was always going to fail, for reasons that no amount of knowing or doing could have touched. That is the bottom of this story. Not that they failed to see, not even that they failed to act, but that seeing and acting, both, were not enough, because the thing that had been taken from them in 1204 was the ground underneath both. The man who made that final desperate gamble, who paid the price and got nothing, was named John, the 8th emperor of that name, and his story is the hinge on which this entire tragedy turns. John VIII Palaeologos became senior emperor in 1425, and he inherited a problem that had a known solution that could not be implemented. The solution was simple to state. The empire needed a Western army. The West was rich, populous, and in possession of the new gunpowder warfare that was beginning to reshape the battlefield. A serious crusade, a real one, with the resources of the Latin kingdoms behind it, could potentially break the Ottoman grip on the Balkans and save the city. Everyone in Constantinople understood that this was the only realistic path to survival. The problem was the price. The West, and specifically the papacy, had made its terms clear for generations. There would be no army until the schism was healed, until the Eastern Orthodox Church submitted to the authority of Rome and accepted the Roman positions on the points of doctrine that had divided the two churches for 400 years. The price of a Western army was the surrender of the Eastern Church. The price of saving the body was the surrender of the soul. And here is the detail that makes John VIII's choice almost unbearable to read about, because it means he was warned specifically and from the highest possible authority, and he did it anyway. His father was Manuel II, the scholar emperor, the man who had ridden as a vassal in the Sultan's army and spent his life begging the West for help that never came. Manuel had thought longer and harder about the Ottoman problem than anyone alive, and on his deathbed, according to the chronicler George Francis, who was there in the imperial service, Manuel gave his son a piece of advice that was as cynical as it was clear-sighted. He told John that the union with the Western Church was the single thing the Ottomans feared most, because a real union might summon a real crusade. And therefore, Manuel said, the prospect of union was the most valuable card the empire held, and the way to play it was to never actually play it. Keep negotiating it, keep dangling it, keep the councils going and the discussions alive and the possibility forever on the table, because the threat of union was a perpetual restraint on the Sultan. But never conclude it, never actually sign, because the moment you sign, two things happen, and both are fatal. The Ottomans, no longer restrained by the fear of what union might bring, will attack to preempt the crusade, and your own people, who will never accept union in their hearts, will turn against you and tear the city apart from the inside. The union, Manuel told his son, is a weapon that only works while it is sheathed. Draw it and it cuts the hand that holds it. That was the diagnosis, delivered by a dying emperor to his heir, and it was exactly, precisely, devastatingly correct. Everything Manuel predicted came true. The moment the union was concluded at Florence, the population turned against the emperor and the Ottomans. Far from being deterred, moved toward the final confrontation. John VIII had been handed, by his own father, an accurate forecast of the catastrophe his decision would bring, and he made the decision regardless, not because he was foolish, but because his father's advice depended on having time, on the luxury of keeping a card unplayed forever, and John no longer had that luxury. The noose was tightening faster than the bluff could hold. He gambled that an actual union might actually summon an actual army, because the slow strangulation was going to kill the city anyway. He knew the risk. His father had spelled it out for him in detail. He could see the trap with total clarity, and he walked into it on purpose, because every other path on the board also ended in the city's death, and at least this one had a chance, however slim, of ending somewhere else. That is not the behavior of a man who could not see. That is the behavior of a man who could see perfectly and had no good move left to make, and John VIII decided to pay it. In 1437, he assembled a delegation of around 700 people, the emperor himself, the aged patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph II, and a great many of the leading bishops and theologians of the Orthodox world, and he prepared to sail to Italy to negotiate the union of the churches in person. The empire was so poor that funding the journey was itself a crisis, and there is a detail here that tells you everything about the state of things. To help pay for the delegation's travel, the emperor reportedly drew on alms that had been sent from Russia, from the Orthodox faithful of Moscow, money given for the upkeep of a monastery in Constantinople, redirected to fund a voyage whose purpose was to subordinate the Orthodox Church to Rome. The faithful of Moscow would have been horrified if they had known. They found out soon enough, and it poisoned the relationship between the Greek and Russian churches in ways that outlived the empire. The council convened in the Italian cities of Ferrara and then Florence over 1438 and 1439, and what happened there was, on a purely intellectual level, one of the most extraordinary theological summits in the history of Christianity. For months, the finest minds of the Eastern and Western churches argued in enormous technical detail over the precise doctrinal questions that separated them. The largest of these was a single word. In the Latin version of the Nicene Creed, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Latin word for and the Son is filioque. The Greek church had never accepted that addition. To the Greeks, the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, and the Latin insertion of and the Son was both theologically wrong and a unilateral corruption of a creed that was supposed to be unalterable. Entire libraries had been written on this question. Men considered it worth dividing the body of Christ over. There were other points: the nature of purgatory, whether the bread of the Eucharist should be leavened or unleavened, and above all the question of papal primacy, whether the Pope held supreme authority over the entire Christian Church, including the Eastern Patriarchs. But the filioque was the heart of it, a war fought over a conjunction. And inside that council, two men embodied the two ways of understanding the empire's predicament, and I want you to hold both of them in your mind because between them they contain the entire tragedy. The first was Bessarion, the Metropolitan of Nicaea, a brilliant young scholar from Trebizond, perhaps the finest Greek mind of his generation. Bessarion argued for union. He came to believe that the theological differences, when examined honestly and at depth, were reconcilable, that the Greek and Latin formulations were two ways of expressing a compatible truth, and that the schism was as much a matter of pride and politics and language as of genuine doctrine. But Bessarion also saw, with absolute clarity, the practical stakes. He understood that without the union there would be no army, and without the army the city would fall, and with the city would fall the entire civilization, the libraries, the learning, the unbroken thread back to the ancient world. For Bessarion, union was not a betrayal of the faith. It was the only way to save everything the faith was carried in. The second man was Mark Eugenikos, the Metropolitan of Ephesus, and Mark refused. He examined the same theological questions and concluded that the differences were real, that the Latin positions were genuinely heretical, and that no practical benefit, no army, no rescue, no survival of the city itself could justify the surrender of the true faith. To accept the filioque to buy soldiers was to lose the thing the soldiers were supposed to protect. When the union was finally agreed and the decree was drawn up, almost every Greek bishop present signed it. Mark Eugenikos did not. He was the single Orthodox prelate of the entire delegation who refused his signature. And when the Pope was told that the decree had been signed by all but one, he is reported to have said, "Then we have accomplished nothing." The union was proclaimed on the 6th of July, 1439, in the Cathedral of Florence under Brunelleschi's great dome, in a decree that opens with the words Laetentur caeli, let the heavens rejoice. On paper, the schism of 400 years was healed. The emperor had his union. Now he would get his army. The delegation sailed home to Constantinople believing, or at least hoping, that they had saved the empire, and they sailed directly into the proof that they had not, because the union that had been signed in Florence was rejected, immediately and overwhelmingly, by the people in whose name it had been signed. This is the part that I think is most important to understand correctly, because it is so easy to get wrong, to dismiss the Orthodox population as backward zealots who chose their dogma over their survival. They were nothing of the kind. The refusal of the union by the people of Constantinople was, in its own terrible way, entirely rational, and to see why you have to understand what the ordinary Greek had actually learnt about the West over the previous 250 years. What had the West ever brought them? The West had brought them the Fourth Crusade. The West had brought the sack of 1204, the prostitute on the patriarch's throne, the bronze horses carried off to Venice, the relics looted, the city burned. The West had brought the Venetians and the Genoese, who now ran their trade and held their crown jewels in pawn. To the ordinary inhabitant of Constantinople, submission to Rome did not look like rescue. It looked like the final surrender to the very people who had been bleeding them for a quarter of a millennium. It looked like giving up the last thing they still owned, their faith, their identity as the true church, in exchange for a promise of help from people whose promises of help had a long and consistent record of being worthless. And the sentiment that crystallized this refusal has come down to us in a single brutal sentence. It is usually attributed to Lucas Notaras, the Megas Dou, the Grand Admiral, the highest-ranking official in the empire after the emperor himself. He is supposed to have said that he would rather see the turban of the Turks reigning in the center of the city than the Latin mitra. I have to be honest with you about this quote, because honesty is the whole point with this audience, and you would catch me if I were not. The attribution to Notaras is probably wrong. It comes to us through the historian Ducas, who was hostile to Notaras and had reasons to put damning words in his mouth, and modern scholars are skeptical that Notaras said it in those words. But here is why it does not matter whether one specific man said one specific sentence. The sentiment was real, and it was widespread, and the fact that it could be so plausibly attributed to the second most powerful man in the empire tells you exactly how mainstream it was. A very large part of the population of Constantinople had genuinely concluded that Ottoman rule was preferable to union with Rome. They had done the arithmetic on a different question than the emperor was asking, and they had arrived at a defensible answer. Under the Turks, they reasoned, the Orthodox Church might survive as a subordinate but intact institution. Under Rome, it would be dissolved into Catholicism and lost. And the Turks, unlike the Crusaders, had never sacked the city. So look at the trap, fully sprung. The emperor needed the army. The army required the union. The union, once obtained, was rejected by the people, which meant it could not actually be implemented, which meant the religious surrender produced all of its costs. The division of the population, the delegitimization of the emperor in the eyes of his own subjects, the bitterness that would linger right up to the final siege, and almost none of its benefits. The empire had paid the price and not received the goods. And worst of all, the one tangible piece of help the Union did manage to produce demonstrated, in the most violent way possible, that even a successful union would not have been enough. Because there was a crusade, the Union was not entirely barren. It helped motivate a genuine Western military expedition, the Crusade of Varna, a real army of Hungarians and Poles and others under the Hungarian general John Hunyadi and the young King Ladislaw, which marched into the Balkans against the Ottomans in 1444. For a moment it looked like the gamble might pay off. And then, in November of 1444, on the Black Sea coast at Varna, the Ottoman Sultan Murad II met the crusade and annihilated it. The young King Ladislaw was killed, his head reportedly cut off and displayed on a spear. The crusade was destroyed. The last serious Western military effort to save the Balkans from the Ottomans ended in catastrophe. 4 years after the union that was supposed to summon it, and 9 years before the city it was meant to save would fall. When the news of Varna reached the Emperor John VIII, something in him broke. The contemporary accounts describe a man whose spirit was simply gone after that. He had spent the political capital of his reign, he had divided his church and his people, he had paid the unpayable price of the Union, and the army that Price had purchased had been wiped out in a single afternoon on a beach in Bulgaria. He had been right about the strategy. That is the thing. He had correctly identified the only path that could have saved the empire, and he had executed it. And it had failed anyway. John VIII died in 1448, 4.5 years after Varna, the last Byzantine emperor to die peacefully in his bed, leaving the throne and the doomed city to his younger brother. He was the man who saw the answer most clearly and did the most to act on it, and was rewarded with the clearest possible demonstration that seeing and acting were not going to be enough. And Bessarion, the great unionist, the man who had argued that saving the city was worth the theological price, watched his life's cause collapse from both ends. The union he had championed was rejected by his own people as a betrayal, and the army it was supposed to summon was destroyed at Varna. Branded a near traitor in the city of his birth, his arguments dismissed, his hopes for his homeland in ruins, Bessarion did the only thing left to a man in his position. He left. He had been made a cardinal of the Roman Church, and he moved permanently to Italy, and he spent the rest of his life on 2 projects. The first was trying, and failing, to organize another crusade to save or retake Constantinople, an effort that came to nothing. The second was quietly, methodically buying up and copying Greek manuscripts, the texts of the ancient world and the Byzantine inheritance, and shipping them to safety in the West. He understood that the body of his civilization was going to die, and so he set himself to preserving its mind. His enormous library of Greek manuscripts became the founding core of one of the great libraries of Europe, the Bibliotheca Marciana in Venice, where a substantial part of it survives to this day. The man who tried hardest to save Constantinople could not save it. And so he saved its books instead and shipped them, with a grief I can only imagine, to the very city whose ancestors had sacked his own. That was where things stood when the younger brother, Constantine, came to the throne in 1449. The union paid for and useless, the army summoned and destroyed, the population divided and bitter, the treasury empty as it had been for a century, the territory reduced to the city and a few scraps, and across the water a new sultan had just taken the Ottoman throne, a young man of 19 who had been thinking since boyhood about one thing more than any other. He was going to take the city that no Muslim army had ever taken, and he was going to do it with a weapon that had recently been offered to and refused by the people he was about to use it on. Constantine XI Palaiologos was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 1449, and the circumstances of that coronation are themselves a kind of omen, though the people involved would not have wanted to read them that way. He was not crowned in Hagia Sophia. He could not be. The union was so toxic and the patriarchate so compromised by the religious quarrel that a grand coronation in the great cathedral was politically impossible. So Constantine was crowned far from his own capital, down in the despotate of the Morea, in the fortress city of Mistras in the southern Greek mountains. The only Byzantine emperor in the entire 1100-year history of the title to be crowned outside Constantinople. The last emperor of the Romans received his crown in a provincial town because his own capital was too divided to give it to him. He then traveled to the city by ship to take up a throne in a cathedral whose own liturgy half his subjects now boycotted. He was, by every account, a serious and capable man, and crucially he was a soldier rather than a scholar or a theologian. He had spent years as the Byzantine governor of the Morea, and there he had actually accomplished things. Real military things, reconquering territory from the Latin principalities in southern Greece and rebuilding the great defensive wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, the Hexamilion, the 6-mile wall, to seal off the peninsula. The Ottomans had knocked it down, but the point is that Constantine was a man who did things, who built walls and led armies, not a man who merely watched. If anyone could have changed the trajectory by force of personal will and competence, it would have been him. He is the test case. He had the clearest possible sight of the danger, he had genuine ability, he had courage that no one has ever questioned, and he had the throne. And it is precisely because he had all of that, and it still was not enough, that his story is the final proof of the thesis. The problem was never the quality of the man at the top. The problem was that no quality of man could supply what 1204 had taken away. Across the water, the man who meant to kill him had taken the Ottoman throne in 1451 at the age of 19. Mehmed II was not the impulsive boy the older Ottoman statesman took him for. He was cold, brilliant, fluent in several languages, a reader of history who consciously modelled himself on Alexander and on the Caesars, and he was completely fixated on a single objective. He intended to take Constantinople. It was not merely a strategic goal. The city sat in the middle of his territory like a stone in a shoe, a foreign capital splitting his European lands from his Asian ones, and beyond the strategy there was the prestige, the almost mythic status that would attach to the ruler who finally took the city that had turned away every army for 1,000 years. There was a saying in the Islamic world, attributed to the Prophet, that the city would one day fall to a great Muslim commander and his army, and Mehmed intended to be that commander. He began not with an army, but with a wall of his own. In the spring of 1452, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of the strait, a few miles north of the city, Mehmed built a fortress. He built it with shocking speed, in about 4.5 months, using thousands of laborers, and he built it directly across the water from an older fortress his great-grandfather had built on the Asian side. With both forts in place, Mehmed controlled the narrowest point of the only waterway connecting the Black Sea to the city and the Mediterranean beyond. He could now close the strait at will. The fortress was officially named for cutting the strait, but the Greeks gave it the name that stuck. They called it Bochas Kesen, which carries a deliberate double meaning. It means the cutter of the strait. It also means the cutter of the throat. Mehmed had built a knife against the city's windpipe, and he had done it while the two empires were still nominally at peace. To show that the knife was real, he used it. He proclaimed that every ship passing through the strait would stop and pay a toll and submit to inspection. In November of 1452, a Venetian ship under a captain named Antonio Rizzo tried to run the strait without stopping. The new fortress opened fire with its cannon and sank it. The survivors who made it to shore were captured. Most of the crew were beheaded. Rizzo, the captain, was impaled on a stake and his body left as a warning. The message to the city and to the Italian trading powers was unmistakable. The strait was closed. The grain ships from the Black Sea, on which the city partly depended, could be sunk at will, and there was nothing the emperor could do about it, because the fortress was already built and the empire had no fleet capable of challenging it. Constantine sent envoys to protest. Mehmed had them imprisoned and some of them executed. The diplomacy was over. Both men knew what was coming. Inside the city, Constantine did the only things he could do, and they were pitifully small against the scale of the threat, and he knew they were. He stockpiled what food he could. He repaired the walls where the masonry had crumbled. He wrote, again, to the West, to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to anyone, begging for the army that 2 centuries of begging had never produced. And he made one last attempt to activate the union. The price his brother had paid, because the Pope had made clear that meaningful aid depended on the union being publicly, liturgically enacted in the city. So in December of 1452, a papal legate, a Greek by birth who had become a Catholic cardinal named Isidore, celebrated the union in a full liturgy in Hagia Sophia, with the names of the Pope and the union formally proclaimed under the Great Dome. It was meant to unlock Western aid. What it actually did was tear the city apart one more time, weeks before the siege. The anti-union population was enraged. Many of the faithful refused to enter Hagia Sophia afterward, regarding it as defiled by the Latin Rite. The Grand Cathedral of the Eastern Church stood half empty in the final winter because its own congregation considered it polluted, and the Western aid that this final humiliation was supposed to purchase amounted to a few hundred men, not an army, a gesture. I want to be fair to the West here, because the easy version of this story makes the Latins into villains who watched Constantinople die out of spite. And that is not quite the truth either. The deeper truth is bleaker, because it is structural rather than malicious. The West did not refuse to send an army primarily out of cruelty or even out of the lingering contempt of the schism. The West did not send an army because the West, in the 1440s and 50s, was in no condition to send one. England and France had spent more than a century destroying each other in the 100 Years' War and were near its exhausted end. The kingdoms of Spain were consumed by their own long war, the Reconquista against the Muslim South. The Holy Roman Empire was a fractured patchwork of princes who agreed on nothing. The one Western power, with both the proximity and the motive to fight the Ottomans, the Kingdom of Hungary, had just had its army and its king annihilated at Varna in 1444, the very crusade the Union was supposed to summon. The Pope wanted to help and lacked the power to compel anyone to do so, because the age when a Pope could summon kings to crusade with a word was already over, and the 2 powers that did have fleets and money and a presence in the East, Venice and Genoa, had calculated, coldly and correctly, that their commercial interests were better served by maintaining their lucrative treaties with the Ottomans than by throwing themselves into a war to save a bankrupt rival whose trade they had already captured. So the West did not abandon Constantinople in a single act of betrayal. It simply failed to materialize, piece by piece, for a dozen separate structural reasons, each of which was, from the point of view of the people involved, perfectly reasonable. The city did not die because the West hated it. The city died because no one with the power to save it had a sufficient reason to. And a dying state cannot manufacture in others a reason that does not already exist. That is its own kind of horror, quieter than malice and far more final. You can rage against an enemy, There is nothing to rage against in a coalition that simply never assembles. The most significant body of foreign help that did arrive came not from any king or pope, but from a private Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a professional specialist in the defense of walled cities, who sailed into the city in January of 1453 with around 700 well-armed and well-trained men that he had recruited and equipped largely at his own expense. Constantine was so grateful and so aware of how badly he needed real military expertise that he effectively put Giustiniani in command of the land wall defense, the most critical sector. Remember him, around 700 professional soldiers and one capable commander. Against what was coming, that was a great deal, and it was also almost nothing. And both of those things were true at once. Because what was coming was, by the standards of the age, enormous. Through the early months of 1453, Mehmed assembled an army the size of which the contemporary sources wildly disagree about, with Greek and Italian eyewitnesses giving figures as high as 160,000 or even 200,000. Numbers that modern historians treat as the inflations of frightened men. The figure that most modern scholars settle on is somewhere in the range of 50,000 to 80,000 fighting men, plus a fleet of well over 100 ships, possibly several hundred counting the smaller craft, to blockade the city from the sea. And he was bringing the guns. He brought a whole train of artillery, the new gunpowder cannon that were beginning to make the high medieval wall obsolete, and at the center of that train, dragged over the roads of Thrace by its team of 60 oxen and 400 men, came the great bombard that Orban had cast, the gun that had been offered to Constantine the previous year, the gun the city could not afford, now arriving at the city's walls in the hands of the man who could. I keep coming back to that cannon because it is the whole story compressed into a single object. The emperor inside the walls had seen that exact weapon, had understood what it could do, had wanted it, and had been unable to buy it. Now it was being wheeled into position against him, and he would watch it being assembled through the early days of April, knowing precisely what it was, knowing he had held the chance to own it, knowing that the chance had meant nothing because the money had not been there. The knowledge had been perfect, and the knowledge had been useless. That is the condition this entire civilization had been living in for 250 years. And now it was about to be expressed in stone and bronze against the only walls that had ever kept it alive. On the 2nd of April, 1453, the first Ottoman troops appeared before the land walls of Constantinople. On the 6th, the main army arrived and the siege began in earnest. And the last thing Constantine did before it closed was order a count. He needed to know how many men he actually had to defend the city. He gave the task to his friend and closest official, a man named George Francis, and he ordered Francis to compile, from each district, the exact number of men capable of bearing arms, including monks. And when Francis finished the count and brought him the number, the emperor told him to tell no one. The number was to be kept secret between the two of them, because if it became known, it would destroy what was left of the city's morale. We know the number anyway, because Francis survived and wrote it down. And it is one of the most quietly devastating numbers in the whole of military history. 4,773. That was how many Greeks of fighting age Francis could find in the entire city of Constantinople. Add to that the foreigners, the Genoese under Giustiniani, the Venetians who chose to stay, the men of various nations who were caught in the city or volunteered to defend it, and the most careful modern reconstructions put the total number of defenders at somewhere under 8,000 men. Call it 7,000 to 8,000 at the absolute most, against an army of 50,000 to 80,000. And those defenders had to hold the land walls which ran for about 4 miles across the neck of the peninsula, plus the sea walls along the Golden Horn and the Marmara shore, for a total defensive perimeter of around 12 miles. Do the arithmetic that Constantine did, alone, in the dark, with the number he had forbidden Francis to repeat. 12 miles of wall, under 8,000 men. That is not enough men to stand shoulder to shoulder along the perimeter, let alone to hold reserves, to rotate exhausted troops, to respond to a breach. The city that had been the largest in the Christian world, that had once held hundreds of thousands of people, could field fewer than 8,000 defenders for walls built to be manned by many times that number. The walls were the same. The empire behind them was gone. A wall is only as strong as the number of living men standing on it. And the men were not there, because the city behind the wall was a husk, because the empire had been hollow for 250 years, because of 1204. This is the misconception I most want to correct, the one that everything in this story has been building toward, because it is the comfortable lie that lets people file the fall of Constantinople under bad luck or superior technology. People say the walls of Constantinople fell because of the cannon. The 1,000-year walls met the new gunpowder artillery, and the artillery won, and the age of the castle gave way to the age of the gun. It is a tidy story about technology, and it is mostly wrong. The walls did not fall because the cannon was unstoppable. We will see, in a moment, that the cannon was in many ways a clumsy and limited weapon. The walls fell because there were not enough men to hold them. A fully manned Theodosian wall, with the defenders the system was designed for, might well have held even against Orban's gun, because a breach is only fatal if the enemy can exploit it faster than you can fill it with bodies. And the defenders had almost no bodies to spare. The decisive shortage at Constantinople in 1453 was not a shortage of stone or a shortage of technology. It was a shortage of Romans, and that shortage was the cumulative interest on a debt incurred in 1204. The cannon did not kill the city. The cannon merely arrived to collect. The bombardment began in the second week of April and went on, day after day, for the better part of 7 weeks. Orban's great gun and the smaller cannon alongside it pounded the land walls, and the effect was genuinely terrible. Sections of the outer wall that had stood for 1,000 years cracked and crumbled and came down in heaps of rubble. The psychological effect of the noise alone, the concussion of a 1,200-pound stone ball striking the masonry, was something the defenders had never experienced. And yet, here is where you have to remember the detail I asked you to hold on to at the very beginning. The great gun could only be fired about 7 times a day. It took hours to cool, to swab, to reload, to re-aim. And so after each section of wall came down, there were hours before the next shot. And in those hours, the defenders did the only thing they could do. They rebuilt. Every night, under cover of darkness, the people of the city, soldiers and civilians, men and women, came out to the broken sections and filled the gaps. They piled rubble, earth, timber, barrels of soil, anything they could find, into makeshift ramparts across the breaches. A stockade of earth and wood actually absorbed the cannonballs better than rigid stone because it gave instead of shattering. And so the siege settled into a brutal rhythm. The gun would batter down a section by day. The defenders would rebuild it by night. The gun would batter it again. They rebuilt it again. For weeks. The slow rate of fire of the very weapon that was supposed to make the walls obsolete was the thing that kept the city alive, day after day, far longer than anyone had expected. So the cannon alone could not do it, and Mehmed knew it. The siege was becoming a race between his ability to breach and their ability to repair, and with under 8,000 defenders, the city was holding. Exhausted but holding. Mehmed needed to stretch those defenders thinner. He needed to open a second front, and the obvious place was the Golden Horn, the great natural harbour that ran along the northern side of the city. If he could get his fleet into the Horn, he could threaten the sea walls there, the lowest and weakest walls in the whole circuit, and the defenders would have to peel men away from the critical land walls to defend them. But the Horn was sealed. Across its mouth, from the city to the Genoese town of Galata on the far side, the Byzantines had stretched a massive iron chain supported on floating barrels, an old and proven defense that physically blocked enemy ships from entering. Behind that chain sat the Christian fleet, and the chain had held the Horn secure for centuries. What Mehmed did about the chain is one of the most audacious feats of the entire siege, and it is true. It is not legend. It is attested across multiple independent sources. He decided not to break the chain. He decided to go around it. On the night of the 22nd of April, he had his men haul a substantial part of his fleet, somewhere around 70 or 80 ships, out of the water of the Bosphorus, up and over the hill behind Galata, on a road of greased wooden rollers and timber tracks his engineers had prepared, and down the other side into the waters of the Golden Horn, above the chain. The defenders woke to find Ottoman warships floating in their protected harbour, ships that had crossed dry land in the night, ships that had no business being where they were. The chain, the great defence, was now useless. It guarded an entrance the enemy had simply stepped around. And exactly as Mehmed had intended, the defenders now had to thin their already impossibly thin lines to put men on the Golden Horn sea walls. 7,000 to 8,000 men, now stretched across an even longer active front. The defenders tried to fight back. On the night of the 28th of April, a small Christian flotilla attempted to slip across the Horn and burn the Ottoman ships that had been hauled over the hill. The attempt failed, betrayed possibly by spies in Galata, and the Ottoman guns sank some of the attacking vessels. Around 40 of the Christian sailors who survived and were captured were executed in full view of the walls, impaled where the defenders could see them. The defenders responded in kind. They brought out the Ottoman prisoners they held, around 260 of them, and beheaded them on the ramparts, one by one in full view of the besieging army. Two civilizations that had spent the entire siege reading omens and praying to the same God in different languages, now answering each other in the only language a siege finally speaks, which is the display of the enemy's dead. By the middle of May, the situation inside the city was desperate in a way that the defenders, exhausted, hungry, stretched along 12 miles of wall in numbers too small to hold it, understood completely. They were not waiting for rescue anymore. The Venetian ships in the harbour knew no relief fleet was coming. A single ship had been sent out into the Mediterranean in early May to look for the promised Venetian relief expedition, and it searched and found nothing, and its crew took a vote on whether to even return to the doomed city. And they returned, out of honour, to report that no help was on the way. The men on the walls knew the math. Constantine knew the math, better than any of them, because he was the one who had ordered the count. And it is in these final 2 weeks, with the outcome no longer in any real doubt to anyone honest enough to look at it, that the people of the city stopped reading the situation in numbers and started reading it in signs. Because when the arithmetic offers you nothing but the date of your death, you look up at the sky instead. And in the last week of May, 1453, the sky answered them. There was an old prophecy in the city, one of many, that Constantinople could never fall while the moon was full and waxing, that the city was under the protection of the moon, and that no enemy could take it as long as the moon was growing toward fullness. On the 24th of May, the moon would be full. For days before, the defenders held on to this. The moon was nearly full. The protection was nearly at its strongest. And then, on the night of the 22nd of May, 3 days before the full moon, there was an eclipse. The full moon, when it came, rose already darkened, the earth's shadow drawn across it, and to a city that had been told it would stand only as long as the moon waxed bright, a lunar eclipse at the very moment the moon should have been at its protective peak was not an astronomical curiosity. It was the withdrawal of the protection. The Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro, who was inside the city and kept a diary of the siege, recorded the eclipse and recorded what it did to the morale of the defenders. We can confirm, from modern astronomical calculation, that there was in fact a lunar eclipse visible over Constantinople in those final days of May 1453. The omen was real in the sense that the event was real. The people who read disaster in it were, as it turned out, not wrong about what was coming. They were only wrong about why. The next day, the 23rd of May, the city tried to call on its oldest protector. The most sacred object in Constantinople was an icon of the Virgin Mary, the Hodegetria, the one who shows the way, a painting attributed by tradition to St. Luke himself. The holy palladium that was believed to have saved the city from sieges in centuries past. In its hour of extremity, the city did what it had always done. The icon was taken up and carried in solemn procession through the streets, the whole grieving population following, praying for the intercession that had saved them before. And during the procession, the icon slipped from the platform on which it was carried and fell face down into the mud of the street. When the bearers tried to lift it, the accounts say it seemed unnaturally heavy, as though it did not want to be raised, as though it were resisting. And then, as they struggled with it, a sudden and violent thunderstorm broke over the city, a deluge so heavy that the streets ran like rivers and children were nearly swept away in the flood, and the procession had to be abandoned. The holiest object in the Christian East, fallen in the mud, refusing to rise, in a storm that scattered its own procession. I do not think you need to believe in omens to understand what that did to people who did. And then on the 24th, the day of the eclipsed full moon, came the strangest of them all, and it is the one that historians treat most carefully, because it is reported by so many independent witnesses on both sides of the wall that something genuinely did happen, whatever its cause. A thick, heavy fog descended on the city, unseasonable for late May. Unusual enough that it was remarked on by everyone. Fog in Constantinople in late May is rare. And that evening, as the fog lay over the city, witnesses both inside the walls and in the Ottoman camp outside reported a strange light, variously described as a glow or a flame or a luminance, that appeared to play around the dome of Hagia Sophia, rising up the great cathedral, lingering at its summit, and then vanishing into the sky. The Christians who saw it read it one way. They said it was the light of God, the Holy Spirit, the divine presence that had dwelt in the great church for 900 years, rising up out of the dome and departing, abandoning the cathedral, abandoning the city, withdrawing the protection of heaven before the end. There are modern explanations, and they are plausible. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly the eruption of the Pacific volcano now called Kuwait, had thrown enormous quantities of ash and aerosols into the upper atmosphere around this time, and unusual atmospheric optical effects, strange lights, discolored skies, were reported across the world in this period. The fog and the light may have been the distant chemistry of a volcano on the other side of the planet, scattering light over a doomed cathedral. But understand what that means. The omen was, again, real. Something was in the sky. The people saw it accurately. They simply attributed it to a god withdrawing rather than to a mechanism they had no way of knowing about. They were excellent observers, and they were reading a real signal. They were only wrong about the cause, which is, when you think about it, the exact shape of their entire civilization's relationship to its own death. They saw it clearly. They read it as fate. It was, in fact, mechanism, the grinding consequence of structural forces set in motion centuries before. They were not hallucinating the end. The end was really there in the sky. They had simply never had the power to do anything about its cause, and so they did the only thing the powerless can do with a clearly seen catastrophe. They gave it meaning. When Mehmed learned of the omens in the city, and he had spies who told him, he is said to have been worried that they might rally the defenders rather than break them, and he hurried his own preparations, because he too read signs, and he too had astrologers, and the date for the final assault was chosen with care. On the evening of the 28th of May, with the great attack set for the following day, Constantine gathered the commanders and the leading men of the city. The speech he is supposed to have given on that night is one of the most famous and most moving orations in European history, a call to die nobly for faith and homeland and family. An emperor telling his men that the four great causes a person should be willing to die for: faith, homeland, family, and sovereign, were all present in this one fight on this one night. And I have to be honest with you about that speech, the same way I was honest about the turban quote, because the honesty is the entire reason this audience is here. The grand, eloquent version of Constantine's final speech that you will find quoted everywhere comes to us primarily through a later source, a 16th century reworking of Francis by a writer we call Pseudos Francis, composed generations after the event. It is, in large part, a literary reconstruction. The historical Constantine may well have addressed his commanders that night, and the sentiment may be true to the man, but the specific stirring words almost certainly belong to a later writer imagining what such a man should have said. What we can say with confidence, because it is consistent across the more reliable sources, is the one thing that actually matters. Constantine did not flee. He had every opportunity. Ships were leaving. He could have escaped to the Morea, to Italy, to a comfortable exile and a continued claim to a lost throne. He stayed. He had done the count. He knew the number. He knew, with the cold precision of the man who had ordered the secret census, that there were not enough men on the walls, and he put on his armor and went to the walls anyway, to die in the place he could not save. The final assault came in the small hours of the 29th of May, 1453, and Mehmed threw his men at the walls in waves, deliberately to exhaust the defenders. First he sent the irregulars, the Bashibazuks, the least trained and least valuable troops, to wear the defenders down and to die doing it. They were thrown back. Then he sent the regular Anatolian troops, better trained, more numerous, and they too were held at the walls, in the most heavily damaged sector, the valley of the Lycus River, where the bombardment had done its worst, and where the defenders had built their stockade of earth and rubble. And then, with the defenders exhausted from hours of fighting, having repelled wave after wave, Mehmed sent his last and best, the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Ottoman household, fresh, disciplined, the finest infantry in the world at that moment, against men who had been fighting all night and rebuilding walls every night for 7 weeks. And in those final hours 2 things happened, close together, that broke the defense, and the story of how it broke is contested in a way I want you to sit with rather than have me resolve, because the contest itself is the point. The first thing is that Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, the professional, the man holding the critical Lycus sector with Constantine beside him, was struck by a projectile and badly wounded. Whether it was a crossbow bolt or a gunshot, whether the wound was to the arm or the chest, the sources disagree. What they agree on is that Giustiniani, in great pain, asked to be carried to the rear to have the wound treated. and that his men, seeing their commander leave the wall, and possibly seeing a gate opened to carry him through, believed the defense was collapsing and began to fall back. The withdrawal of the wounded commander turned, within minutes, into a panic, and a gap opened in the defense at the worst possible moment, with the Janissaries pressing the assault. Constantine reportedly begged Giustiniani to stay, and Giustiniani, in agony, left anyway, and was carried to a ship and died of the wound a few days later. The Venetian Barbaro, who detested the Genoese, blamed Giustiniani bitterly for the fall, and you can still feel the rage in his diary across nearly 6 centuries. Whether that rage is fair is something historians still argue about. A man was gravely wounded after weeks of heroic defense and wanted his wound treated. It is hard to call that cowardice, but the timing was catastrophic. The second thing is the Kerkerporter, and here I am going to flag the legend as a legend, because you deserve to know which parts of this are solid and which are the kind of story people tell to make sense of a catastrophe. There was, the story goes, a small postern gate in the walls near the Blasciani Palace, the Kerkerporter, the circus gate, that had been opened for a sortie and was, in the chaos, left unlocked, and a small group of Ottoman soldiers found it open, slipped through, climbed to the top of a tower, and raised an Ottoman banner. And the sight of that banner flying from a tower inside the walls, combined with the collapse at the Lycus, convinced the defenders that the city was lost and broke their will to fight. It is a vivid story, the empire undone by one unlocked door, and it may be true, but a number of serious historians regard the Kerkerporter story with suspicion, as exactly the kind of single, comprehensible, almost moral explanation that people reach for when the real cause is something vast and diffuse and unbearable. Because the real cause was not an unlocked gate. The real cause was that there were under 8,000 men on 12 miles of wall, and that this was so because the city was a husk, and that the city was a husk because of everything you have watched unfold across the last 2 centuries. An unlocked gate is a story a human mind can hold. The slow structural death of a civilization is not. We reach for the gate because we cannot hold the other thing, and I think the people who survived reached for it for exactly the same reason they reached for the moon and the icon and the light on the dome. When the true cause is too large and too old and too far beyond your power to have changed, you find a smaller cause you can name. You make it a gate, or a wounded general, or the will of God. Anything but the truth, which is that it was decided long ago and you were only ever watching. And I owe you one more piece of honesty before the end, because it cuts against the grain of everything I have argued, and I would rather hand it to you than have you find it on your own and feel I had hidden it. Not every historian agrees that the fall was inevitable, and they have a point worth taking seriously. At the level of the siege itself, the spring of 1453, the thing was closer run than the long structural story suggests. The walls held for 53 days against an army many times the size of their defense. The slow cannon and the nightly repairs nearly turned the siege into the kind of grinding stalemate that breaks a besieging army's morale and forces it to withdraw, which had happened to Ottoman sieges of the city before. If Giustiniani had not been wounded at that exact moment, if a single relief fleet from the west had arrived, if the weather or the supplies or the politics had broken slightly differently, the assault of the 29th of May might have failed like the assaults before it, and Mehmed might have been forced to lift the siege, and the city might have survived another year, or 5, or 20. The military outcome of that specific spring was not written in advance. But notice what that does and does not change. Even if the city had survived 1453, it would still have been a husk of under 8,000 defenders behind 12 miles of wall, still bankrupt, still surrounded, still without the heartland and the population and the capacity that 1204 had carried off. Surviving the siege would have bought the same thing the reprieve of 1402 bought, which is more time on the same trajectory. The tragedy was never that this one siege could not have gone differently. The tragedy is that the empire had been arranged over 2.5 centuries into a condition where even winning the siege would have been only a longer way of losing the war. A near miss does not refute the structural story. It deepens it. They came so close, with so little, that you can see exactly how much the wound of 1204 had cost them, because what they nearly managed on the ruins of an empire is staggering, and it still was not, and could never have been enough. The defense broke. The Ottomans poured through the breaches at the Lycus and over the walls, and the city that had turned away every army for 1,000 years was at last taken by storm for the second time in its history, and the first time had also been the work of men with crosses on their chests. As for Constantine, the last emperor of the Romans, he did what he had decided to do on the night he ordered the count and told no one the number. The most credible accounts say that when he saw the walls were lost, he stripped off the imperial regalia, the purple, the marks of rank, so that he would not be taken alive or recognized, and he drew his sword and charged into the oncoming Ottoman soldiers as an anonymous man, and he was cut down somewhere in the press, and his body was never identified. The emperor of the Romans died as a nameless soldier in a breach in his own walls, and no one ever found him, and to this day no one knows where he fell or where he lies. He had ruled 4 years. He was the 88th emperor in an unbroken line that ran back through Constantinople and before that through Rome itself, more than 1,500 years to Augustus. And then the line simply stopped. In the smoke, in a breach, in a man who had taken off his crown so that he could die without it. The sack lasted 3 days, by the custom of the age, though some accounts suggest Mehmed reined it in earlier than was usual, because he wanted the city as a living capital, not a gutted ruin. Many of the inhabitants had crowded into Hagia Sophia in the final hours, and there is a reason they chose that place beyond simple sanctuary. There was a prophecy, an old one, that if the enemy ever broke into the city and reached the great square by the cathedral, an angel would descend with a sword and rally the Romans and drive the invaders back, all the way back into Asia, to a place called the Red Apple Tree. So they gathered in the great church, and they waited for the angel and the sword. The angel did not come. The doors were broken in, and the people inside were taken as slaves or killed, and the cathedral, that had been the largest and most beautiful church in the Christian world for 900 years, became, that day, a mosque, which it would remain for the next 5 centuries. Mehmed rode into the city he had taken at the age of 21, and Ottoman tradition records that, as he walked through the ruined great palace of the emperors, the crumbling halls where the Caesars had ruled, he murmured lines of Persian poetry about the transience of empire, about the spider spinning its web in the palace of kings and the owl calling the watch on the towers of long-dead tyrants. He understood what he had conquered. He took for himself the title Caesar of Rome, Kaiser-i-Rum, because in his own mind he had not destroyed the Roman Empire so much as inherited it. The fate of Lucas Notaras, the man the famous quote is hung on, is the bitterest of the human endings, and once more I have to tell you that the most dramatic version is the least certain. Notaras survived the sack. Mehmed initially spared him even, by some accounts, considered employing him in the administration of the conquered city, and then, a few days later, on or around the 3rd of June, Mehmed had him executed along with his son and his son-in-law. The famous account, the one you will read in Edward Gibbon and in Stephen Runciman, and in 100 lesser retellings, comes from the historian Ducas, and it is lurid. In this version, Mehmed at a banquet, drunk, demanded that Notaras hand over his beautiful young son for the Sultan's pleasure, and Notaras refused, saying it was better that he die than deliver his own child to be defiled. And Mehmed in a rage had Notaras and the boy and the son-in-law beheaded on the spot, and Notaras asked only that the two youths be executed before him, so that the sight of his own death would not frighten them into apostasy at the last moment, and he watched them die and then bared his own neck. It is an unforgettable scene. It may not be true. Ducas was hostile to Mehmed and worked in a long tradition of portraying conquerors as monstrous and lustful. Other sources, including the historian Kritavoulos, who wrote under Ottoman patronage, attribute the executions to politics and to Mehmed's suspicion of a powerful man who might become the focus of resistance, with no sexual element at all. Still other sources say the youngest Natara's son was not killed, but taken into the Sultan's household and survived, and indeed a son of Nataras named Jacob did survive and made his way to Italy. I cannot tell you which version is true. I can tell you that the man who supposedly said he would rather have the turban than the mitre got the turban, and it killed him within the week, for reasons that may have had nothing to do with religion at all. And here the story delivers its final, coldest irony, the one that I think is the true bottom of the whole thing, beneath even the death of Constantine. Remember the Great Division, the Union of Florence, the question that tore the city apart in its last years. The Unionists, the party of Bessarion and the emperors, had argued that survival required submission to Rome. The anti-Unionists, the party of Mark of Ephesus, and the turban over the mitre, had argued that the West would take everything and save nothing, and that the Orthodox Church would be safer surviving under the Turks than dissolving into Catholicism. Both parties had staked everything on their reading of the future. And after the conquest, Mehmed II, the man who had taken the city, made his decision about how to govern its Christian population, and his decision settled the argument with a finality that no church council ever could. He sought out the leader of the anti-Unionists, the monk Gennadius Scalarius, the man who had succeeded Mark of Ephesus as the head of the faction that refused Rome, and Mehmed made him Patriarch of Constantinople. He installed the most anti-Western, anti-Catholic churchman in the Greek world as the head of the Orthodox Church under Ottoman rule in the beginning of 1454. And he did it precisely because Gennadius's hatred of the West would keep the Greek population from ever again appealing to Rome for a crusade. The Sultan made the anti-Unionist a patriarch because the anti-Unionist was useful to the Sultan. So the party that said better the turban than the mitre was, in the most literal and brutal sense, proved right. The turban came, and the Orthodox Church did survive under it, as a subordinate but intact institution, with its own patriarch, its own hierarchy, its own faith, recognized and administered within the Ottoman system for the next 450 years. The thing the anti-Unionists predicted came true exactly. And the thing the Unionists predicted, that submission to Rome would buy a saving army, never came true at all, because the army was destroyed at Varna, and the Union brought nothing but division. Both factions could see the future clearly. Both factions were full of brilliant, sincere, well-informed men. And the faction that was right about the future was right about it in the most useless possible way. Because being right that you will survive as a conquered church under a foreign empire is not a strategy for not being conquered. It is just a more accurate forecast of the defeat. They saw it more clearly than their opponents, and it saved nothing, because seeing was never the thing that could have saved them. As for Constantine, the empire that could not save itself in life did the only thing left to it, which was to refuse to let him die. Within a generation of the fall, the legend took shape, and it took the shape of all the dead emperor's people, suspended forever in the moment before they had to accept the end. They said that Constantine had not really died in the breach. They said that at the last moment, as the Turks closed in, an angel had come down and turned the emperor into marble and hidden him in a secret chamber beneath the golden gate of the city, and that he sleeps there still, the marble emperor, the king turned to stone, waiting, and that one day, when the time is right, the angel will return and wake him, and he will rise with his sword and take back the city and drive the conquerors out, all the way back to the red apple tree. It is the same prophecy the people died waiting for in Hagia Sophia, refusing to expire even after it had already failed once, refigured now around the body of the emperor who took off his crown so that no one would find him. The man whose corpse was never identified became the man who cannot die. A whole civilization, unable to accept that the end had really come, encoded its denial into a sleeping king who would set everything right someday on a day that has now been not coming for more than 500 years. I want to come back now to the thing I said at the very beginning, because we have arrived at the place where I can finally say it plainly. I told you that the fall of Constantinople is the clearest case in recorded history of a civilization that saw its own catastrophe coming in full detail and could not act on it. You have now watched that happen. You have watched men of the highest intelligence and the deepest learning diagnose the disease of their empire with complete accuracy across 250 years. They knew about the wound of 1204. They knew the treasury was empty, knew it so precisely that an astronomer recorded the crockery at the coronation. They knew the trade was lost, and the heartland was gone, and the circle was closing. They knew that the only thing that could save them was a Western army, and they knew the exact price the West demanded for it. The previous emperor had even diagnosed the trap of the Union in advance and warned that springing it would be fatal. They saw all of it, and the seeing changed nothing, because by the time they could see it clearly, the power to act on what they saw had already been gone for centuries. And this is the part I need you to actually absorb, not as a fact about the past, but as a structure that should disturb you. Because it is the reason this story has kept me up at night, and the reason I wanted to spend these hours with you on it. The reason the Byzantines could not save themselves was not, in the end, a lack of money or a lack of men, though they lacked both. The deepest reason is that the one move that could have saved the city, the union with Rome, required them to stop being the thing they were. The Eastern Roman identity was not a set of policies you could revise. It was a fusion, total and load-bearing, of Roman political continuity and Orthodox faith, so complete that the Byzantines did not even have a clear concept of separating the spiritual from the temporal, the way the modern West does. To be Roman was to be Orthodox. The emperor was not merely a head of state, he was the earthly reflection of a divine order. And so, when survival required submitting the Orthodox Church to Rome, it was not asking the empire to change a policy. It was asking the empire to dissolve the very thing that made it itself. To save a body by killing the soul that defined the body as worth saving. And a civilization cannot do that on command. The population felt this in their bones, which is why they rejected the Union, no matter how rational the strategic argument for it was. They were not being stupid, they were being what they were, and being what they were was precisely the thing that could not be revised in time to save them. That is what I mean when I say the rot was load-bearing. The very thing that had given the empire its identity and its endurance for 1,000 years, the seamless fusion of faith and state, the refusal to draw a line between the things of God and the things of Caesar, was the exact thing that made the life-saving compromise structurally impossible. The source of their strength was the source of their paralysis. They could not reform the institution that was killing them, because that institution was not a part of them. It was them. And you cannot perform surgery to remove your own spine. So here is the question I am going to leave you with, and I am not going to make it comfortable, because the whole point of this story is that there is no comfort in it. We tell ourselves, constantly, in 100 forms, that knowledge is power, that the way you survive a coming catastrophe is to see it early, to name it, to measure it, to write the report and sound the alarm. We believe, almost as a reflex, that the institutions that fail are the ones that did not see it coming. Constantinople is the standing refutation of that belief. They saw it coming for 250 years. They named it and measured it and wrote it down with a precision we can still read today. Their problem was never that they did not know. Their problem was that the thing they would have had to do to survive was the one thing the structure of who they were did not permit them to do. And no amount of clear sight can give a civilization a capacity that its own foundations have already foreclosed. And every institution you are standing inside of right now works the same way. The thing that gives your country, your profession, your church, your order its identity and its stability, the deep assumption it cannot question without ceasing to be itself, is also the exact place where it will not be able to bend when the ground shifts, no matter how clearly the people inside it can see the shift coming. The reports will be written, the alarms will be sounded, the clear-eyed people will diagnose it perfectly, the way Bessarion did, the way Gregoras did with his crockery and his atoms of Epicurus, the way Constantine did with a census he forbade anyone to repeat. And the diagnosis will arrive precisely on schedule, and it will be precisely correct, and it will change precisely nothing, because the capacity to act on it died quietly a long time before, in some equivalent of a 1204 that nobody at the time recognized as fatal. You do not get to see your own 1204 when it happens. The Crusaders who sacked the city thought they were having a good year. You only get to see it 250 years later, from the top of the wall, when you are the one ordering the count, and the number comes back, and you understand at last that there were never going to be enough men. And you give the order that it be kept secret, because the truth would only break what little is left. Constantine knew the number. He carried it alone. And then he took off his crown so that no one would find him, and he walked into the breach, and the line that ran unbroken for 1,500 years ended in a man who had made himself nameless on purpose. He saw it all coming. They all did. It was the clearest thing in the world, and the seeing was never going to be enough, because the seeing was the only power they had left, and the seeing has never once, in the entire history of anything, been the same thing as the power to change what is seen. The angel never came. The emperor is still asleep under the gate, and the city has now been waiting to be saved for 573 years by a sleeping king who is not going to wake, in a story a dying people told themselves, because the truth, that it was decided long ago and no one could have stopped it, was the one thing they could not bear to know and could never stop knowing.